Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I've heard a lot of mixed perspectives about this video in particular by Sorusness. Does Rinasita fix WuWa's issues? And so, a little bit of framing for this conversation. It does look like Sorusness is a creator that's pretty focused on Hoyo games, specifically Genshin Impact. The only other video they have on their channel is about WuWa calling the launch awful 7 months ago. So there is definitely a bit of an interesting framing on this topic. I am reminded a little bit about HC Casual and whatever the fuck he was doing with this video. But, well, nothing can really be worse than this vid, can it? And this guy's a ZZZ shill. With that in mind, I do have some higher hopes for this content.
Oh, you little silly rover. You're my little pog chow.
I do have some higher hopes for this content. It looks like they are literally making a complaint video about Natlan as a whole, bitching about Mavuika, telling the entire community she's poorly written. So you can tell there's at least some nuance in the conversation over here. This person isn't afraid to be critical about Hoyoverse. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead. I'll give it a spin, right? Because they've got negative framing on WuWa, and they are a returning player. And returning players are one of the biggest audiences that I think Kuro was trying to reach with their 2.0 update.
Does Wuthering Waves version 2 live up to the hype? I feel like I have a different perspective on it than most of the takes I've seen. I played WuWa from day one and loved it, but while I kept playing for the first 6 months, over time I enjoyed it less and less, and ended up taking a break for a few weeks after the release of version 1.4. When version 2 dropped a month later, I was tempted to try it again, but was a bit too preoccupied with figuring out why I was so disappointed by the final act of Natlan to give it any attention.
Hey, that's kind of based. I was busy thinking of ways to shit on Natlan, so I was too busy to play 2.0. Hey, I'm not gonna lie, that's kind of based, isn't it? Why are people in chat saying that they didn't like this video? It starts off very strong.
But some friends who still played kept saying it was a fantastic update and a huge step up which really deserved a second chance, and many people online were raving about it. So over a week after the update dropped, it was time for me to discover Rinasita. While I enjoyed WuWa from day one, right from the start there were some aspects which I felt ambivalent about.
Fucking ambivalent? Hey, pro tip, that word is too complicated for YouTube. That word is too complicated for YouTube. You gotta remember that half of your audience has not even passed their SATs. Let's be real here. That's too complicated. And whatever the fuck they use for standardized tests to get into college in Europe, because I'm assuming she is from Europe.
While I enjoyed WuWa from day one, right from the start there were some aspects which I felt ambivalent about. I shared my first impressions a few weeks after it was first released, but overall it felt like a pretty solid start despite the technical hiccups. Soul 3 didn't quite capture my imagination as much as I'd hoped, and the story quests were a big disappointment despite some great ideas and very polished animations, but the core of the game for me was the combat, and I found it very satisfying to play.
I think she shares a pretty common viewpoint across a lot of people that maybe didn't enjoy some aspects of Wuthering Waves' launch, but then enjoyed very many the other aspects of it. She brings up some valid critiques about the world design potentially not being as engaging or as gripping as it could be. Pretty normal, balanced, well-researched take that is using a lot of actual examples from the game. It makes sense to me so far.
Over time, however, many parts of the game which I had initially enjoyed lost their shine, and the game slowly turned into a chore, which eventually led to me dropping it. Let's talk through each key aspect of the game: exploration, combat, progression systems, endgame, characters, and story, and see how my take on each changed over time, and find out which parts version 2 has improved.
This seems to be a pretty fair, pretty sensical take that weaves in that whole feeling of, I quit the game because stuff was getting too repetitive. Now I want to see if 2.0 changed those repetitive aspects or the stuff that's lost interest for me, and whether or not it's worth playing again based off of the reasons why I initially quit in the first place. So I like the framing. Let's hear a little bit more.
First, the most important part of an open world game for me, exploration. WuWa immediately stood out due to the ease of traversal, most notably the characters being able to sprint straight up walls. For many, this was a huge selling point, but for me, it's emblematic of why I had mixed feelings about the game. On one hand, after spending countless hours exploring open worlds which either make climbing difficult via slow animations and restrictive stamina gauges, or worse, restrict traversal to specific paths marked with yellow paint, it felt incredibly freeing to sprint straight up a mountain and reach the top in no time. While there is a stamina system for climbing, so much of the traversal seemed designed to be as convenient as possible, and it was a breeze to run around the world collecting things and hunting echoes. But, on the other hand, this stripped the exploration of much of its gameplay loop. In other games, while I do hate it when they have a stamina gauge outside of combat for anything other than climbing, I've actually enjoyed stamina-focused climbing to varying degrees. It can be a fun challenge to gauge whether you have enough stamina to reach the next safe spot, or to make trade-offs between climbing speed and stamina consumption, and it can be a big contributor to making the world feel like a large and hostile place.
So I guess this is like the whole having more limitations in the game can make achieving things in spite of those limitations more rewarding. But I do think this is another important perspective to have when it comes to this sort of conversation, right? Climbing in most exploration games that aren't really centered around climbing, it kind of just feels like a big barrier to the actual fun parts. It's like a big barrier to the actual meat of what you're trying to do. And I think the problem here is that in open world gacha games, you're doing everything on the map to pick up a chest, to pick up like a title challenge, or to trigger something that's going to give you astrite, basically. While in actual, you know, like more like single player oriented open world games, exploration like is the game. And sometimes discovering something that doesn't actually reward anything to you is still like part of the game. Or it doesn't give you like premium currency, it gives you like something else. Like imagine climbing to the top of like the towers in Assassin's Creed and like unlocking the map, that sort of thing. It's just like you don't get a reward for that like, you know, lets you upgrade gear or, you know, get something new, but it's like part of the experience there. And I guess in here, across the open world gacha games, it does feel like you're just going through the motions of doing all this climbing, and it's not like really, it's something that's preventing you from having fun in the game or doing what you want to do in the game.
Can be a big contributor to making the world feel like a large and hostile place. Some of the best exploration gameplay can be summed up as the player versus the world. I played an indie game called Jusant, which took this to the extreme and focused entirely on in-depth stamina mechanics supplemented by strategic use of various climbing tools.
But that's the game. I don't think this little boy is fighting things. This is like the key feature of the game versus a side activity or really like a friction point like it is in WuWa or Genshin.
Various climbing tools as you slowly make your way up a gigantic cliff face for hours on end. That level of detail made for a fantastic experience where the climbing itself was an engaging challenge, but this would be difficult to integrate into a truly open world. It's not something I had expected from a game like WuWa, of course, though I feel like there's a decent argument that a major reason that climbing stamina gameplay gets so frustrating so quickly for so many people is that almost all games which have it fail to add any form of player progress to that system other than increasing the size of the stamina bar. Either way, the real point is that there's a wide spectrum here. At one extreme, you have games where there is no gameplay other than traversal mechanics, while at the other extreme, the traversal is intended to be as frictionless as possible. Many people feel that friction is inherently a bad thing, but that's just not always true. WuWa leans towards freedom rather than friction, and that is also not inherently a bad thing. What matters is how it affects the gameplay. WuWa's freedom of traversal absolutely shines when contrasted to other, more restrictive games, but it quickly fades into the background once you start playing regularly. For many people, the end result is that they get to skip the parts of running around the world that they found painful and go straight to the thing they want to do: play quests, solve puzzles, and fight enemies. I can appreciate that freedom, but in the long run, it makes me feel like I'm skipping across the surface of the world, almost like I was never really there. I've yet to find an open world game which gets the climbing the mountain part right in a way which keeps feeling fun over time, but the way WuWa removes that friction doesn't work for me either. Since a large part of the appeal for open world games is the feeling of exploring a new world, my feeling after playing for a few months was that it was a little too far towards the end of the spectrum to keep me entertained. Mount Firmament did capture my attention more than the rest of the map, however. Its aesthetic was much more striking, and some of the exploration mechanics it introduced were much better balanced for my tastes.
So I guess the argument that's being made here is I was able to do things too quickly. Well, you want to know something crazy about WuWa? You want to know something crazy about Wuthering Waves? You can just choose to climb instead. You could just simply choose not to wall run. And so you were given the voluntary choice to speed up your exploration and run up walls. And you could have just simply not held down the right click button and you would have just climbed instead. And so the speed here is literally a choice, and you decided to engage with the world using the fastest possible choices, and you chose the faster one and are now regretting how fast it felt. The problem appears self-inflicted. The problem does appear self-inflicted here. That's just my take, though. Hey, you chose to go quickly. You chose to run up that wall. You didn't have to. You chose to do it. Hey, don't complain about it later.
The same theme echoes when it comes to the loot mapper. Open world games are at their best when they use subtle visual cues to subconsciously guide the player towards any interesting things for them to discover, chests included. In other games, I regularly reach 100% map completion before I even realized it, without using anything like a loot mapper or a treasure compound.
That's a fucking lie. There's no way you're reaching 100% completion in Genshin Impact without using... we just saw a video of somebody who was at like 99% in like 17 regions. Because they're too fucked to use the visual map. Or to use the interactive map. There's no... Come on. You're not getting 100% without external help in games like Genshin Impact. Come on.
Using anything like a loot mapper or a treasure compass to mop up any missing content. WuWa's world always felt fairly mixed on this to me, and it's tough to express why. I'm curious whether the loot mapper is to blame. When a game includes a mechanic which marks every single nearby chest on a map, it no longer matters whether only a tiny percent of people will organically find any given chest, because there's an easy way to guarantee all players will find them if they want to. Sadly, using the loot mapper takes away that feeling of discovery for me and reduces exploration gameplay to just mechanically working through a checkbox exercise.
So don't use it! This is a single player game. You can choose how you want to play it. If seeing the icons for the loot mapper on the map are taking away some of the magic of discovery, don't use it!
Since it felt like I was given a choice between missing out on much of the chest and missing out on any sense of enjoyment, I ended up just not bothering at all. In Renacita, the loot mapper itself has been significantly nerfed. Random chests are less common, and instead there are more activities in the world to have fun with. Technically, there's an even more comprehensive menu which provides a literal list of checkboxes to tick if you want to max out your exploration, but the intuitive exploration was so much better in the new regions that I never felt the need to use it. That, hopefully, points towards a much better balance. The experience of exploring is greatly improved, but you still have that exhaustive guide available if you want to clean up the last few things in each area.
Yeah, I bet she used that shit. I bet she 1000% used that shit. Everything's 100%. Hey, so she did play this game. So she did play a lot of it.
I do have mixed feelings about the lack of chests in the open world, and the plague of mimics all over the place just rubs it in that so much of the world is pretty empty, but overall I've had a good time. Which leads us to the most eye-catching addition in Renacita, flight.
Wait, did she just say that Renacita is empty? Wait, that's a little... Alright, I'm just gonna have to call L take on that one, because... How could you even say that Renacita is even close to empty? What? Yeah, there are mimics, but I mean, since we're talking about gadgets that we for some reason can't stop using, why don't you start using the sensor and you'll be able to know if something's a mimic or not? Right? Since we apparently have no self-control when it comes to game mechanics, why not just use a sensor then to find out if something is a mimic?
Given that the level of freedom we had in version 1 ended up eroding my enjoyment of its exploration, you can see why I was apprehensive at the addition of even more freedom. Flying in particular is tough for open world games. It's the kind of thing that makes even the biggest games feel small, and it can make exploration feel inconsequential. Fortunately, WuWa absolutely nailed it. After spending the previous weeks flying around Natlaun using Chaska, my first few moments with WuWa's flight mechanic were just utter confusion. Physics? Momentum? Stamina? It was very different to what I was accustomed to, and yet it took only a few seconds to get the hang of it and only a minute or two to be truly impressed. Once you launch into the air, there is of course a fantastic sense of speed, and you quickly start trading altitude for even more momentum. If you're going fast enough, you can tilt back and regain that altitude, resulting in an undulating flight path much like the flight of smaller birds. You can also boost your speed at the cost of consuming more stamina. The controls quickly felt very natural, like this was how flight should work in a game like this. And then, for me, it settled into that perfect balance where the sort of gameplay loop of managing altitude and flight stamina didn't require any conscious thought, but provided just enough friction that flying around the world felt engaging. Moments spent speeding through obstacles at the bottom of the arc can be utterly exhilarating, and yet others spent at the top of the arc have a relaxing sense of calm. I'll be shocked if this ever gets old. Now, I just wish we could fly the same way in Jinsho as well.
Pretty fair take on flight. I don't see anything wrong with it. I think it's a pretty unique sentiment across everybody, and I'm glad that she addressed her whole concerns with like the whole freedom piece and how the flight doesn't really, I guess, intrude on that dynamic she was talking about before.
While taking flight really grabs the attention, the other aspects of Renacita's map and exploration do deserve some focus. Much of the new area is fantastic. The cities are actually well populated, there are a ton of different things to do all over the place, some of the puzzles are so much fun, and much of the content content which can technically be considered exploration gameplay, since it counts towards your map exploration, is a bunch of different types of combat. WuWa is definitely playing into its strengths here. Aesthetically, the new area feels very different to the old, and it has many of those wow moments which had been oddly missing for me in the first region. The only thing which feels a little off is that there's something about it which feels oddly disjointed, with regions which don't quite feel like they belong next to their neighbors, though this feeling could just be an inevitable consequence of being able to zoom from place to place so quickly now that we can fly. And special mention to this exploration quest off towards the edge of the map where, after you awaken a boss enemy and start to chase it, it starts destroying the surroundings, smashing its way through bridges and launching boulders and enemies through the air. That was very cool on so many levels, and I'd love to see more like that. When placed next to the older regions, Rinocita's
Just play that back real fast. Bro got fucking eliminated.
boulders and enemies through the air. That was very cool on so many levels, and I'd love to see more like that. When placed next to the older regions, Rinocita's aesthetic may be a little jarring, and while on the whole the exploration still isn't perfect, it is an absolutely huge improvement.
Honestly, I'm pretty good with her whole takes on Renacita. I think she was pretty much on the mark when it comes to all the aspects of it, and maybe some of the shortcomings, because it is pretty fair, right? That once you start going into the Strand, it's kind of like, oh shit, it got real dark real fast. But I do think that's a part of like almost every gacha game. Because like there's a distinct point, or not even every gacha game, every open world game. Because think about it this way. There's like a distinct moment where you will, like in Elden Ring, you'll be walking and then suddenly you'll be in Caelid. And you're like, well, that's not very good. I don't like this one bit at all. And sometimes you don't even realize that you're there.
Next, the combat system. Much like the exploration, this is another area where WuWa stands out, a reason many people absolutely love the game, yet I have mixed feelings about it. When the game first launched, I loved it. The emphasis on skill and timing in combat can sometimes introduce a lot of problems, but WuWa's dodging system is absolutely fantastic, and the parrying can also be pretty great. The early days of learning how it works and getting comfortable with it were a lot of fun. However, once I reached the point where the only remaining challenge was the endgame, my experience with the combat kinda diverged from what the most vocal people say about it. In this kind of game, I see combat complexity as having multiple dimensions, and WuWa's combat leans heavily into only one, mechanical complexity. It has a heavy focus on skill, timing, and learning the moveset of both your characters and your enemies. I found this very fun in the moment at first, as the challenge of getting to grips with the characters and enemies can be quite engaging, and found the dodging mechanic particularly intuitive and satisfying.
So it looks like she is talking about how the main way to succeed in Wuthering Waves' combat is to learn how to play the characters, learn what the enemies do, and then play your characters properly. And now she's getting into how that is causing some issues.
However, I only enjoy this type of complexity up to a certain point. High-level play is a more challenging incarnation of the same principles. Getting good is all about memorizing the movesets of enemies so that you can really nail the timing of counters and parries, which then let you make the most of the most powerful combos and rotations of your characters. Since each character has unique animations, the delay between pressing a button and the hit frames is slightly different, so anytime you have a different character on field, you need to completely adjust your approach if you want to successfully parry. Also, some characters can't parry at all, or only parry with, for example, their third or fourth attack. Combine that with the speed and variety of movesets the more difficult bosses make, and you kinda need to build up muscle memory separately for each character you want to use. For many, this is the depth they want to see in combat. It makes each character feel different. It means there's a very high skill ceiling, and it rewards dedication and in-depth knowledge. I enjoyed it when I was in my honeymoon period with WuWa, but it turns out that in the long run, I just do not find the grind of repeating the same battle over and over engaging at all. I hear that for people who enjoy this, when they do manage to really nail a fight against a difficult enemy, it feels incredibly satisfying. For me, when that happens, instead of an adrenaline rush, I always just think, was that it? And feel like it wasn't worth the time. And unfortunately, the game doesn't make it easy for someone who doesn't inherently love that type of challenge to get into it.
Yeah, it does. Just fucking play Jinsei. What do you mean? Just go play Jinsei. The characters or the gameplay that you're looking for are literally in the game. Just go play Jinsei or Carlotta, and you kind of don't have to give a fuck what the boss is or like what the boss is doing. You literally don't. I think 10 million % Jinsei and Carlotta as characters are designed for if you kind of don't want to engage with the game's mechanics and you kind of just want to like turn your brain off a little bit and just go. You just kind of go. I don't really think anybody can argue against that. The characters literally either deal damage in the air or they CC enemies and actively dodge to do their damage. Those characters are, I think, my definition of like the only real gear check characters in the game, where for the average player who isn't really engaging or learning or mastering the game's mechanics, if you just get good enough gear on your Jinsei and your Carlotta, you will just clear the end game. You don't really need to learn the boss's mechanics at all, and just make sure you're not matching up the wrong elements or the wrong attributes and going against like a type resistance, and you'll clear. There's a reason why Jinsei and Carlotta are the first banners in 2.0. It is specifically designed for players like her. Specifically designed for players like her.
For example, when fighting the tactical holograms, I might have been able to enjoy the process of learning their mechanics in depth if it wasn't for the fact that every time you fail, you need to go through the effort of regaining your energy for all your characters if you want them available from the start of the next fight.
That's actually true. They really need to, like, when you start a hologram, you should have your energy reset to full. I actually don't know why that's not the case currently. Your character can get knocked out and their energy will be reset to 0, and you're just like, okay, this sucks. Happens a lot. I don't see a particular reason why it shouldn't be reset if they're already resetting your HP to full. They're already resetting your HP to full anyways in the game mode. So yeah.
If they had refilled the energy, it might have just tipped into something I'd have gotten hooked on. Instead, it was just too frustrating. It's important to emphasize that this focus is the entire reason the game appeals to some people. I'm not saying the design decisions here are bad in any objective sense, just trying to share why they don't work as well for me. The emphasis on this type of complexity slowly wore away at my enjoyment of the combat over time, though more on that when we get to the endgame section a little later on. Another dimension of complexity is character builds.
So she does have Jinsei though, so I mean, you just learn the team rotation for the Jinsei character, and then you kind of never have to worry about anything ever again. It's the same exact thing for Carlotta. So I'm not really sure where this viewpoint is coming from. It's like, the characters are there with the very simplified kits for you. Like, she has it right here.
Despite the amount of time and effort this eats up, I personally don't think of it as something that WuWa really leans into in any kind of satisfying way. Character and forte talent levels are linear, weapons are gacha, echo stats are endless RNG, and there's surprisingly little flexibility when it comes to echo sets. None of this gives players much control. At best, we can pick a weapon and an echo set and then grind for the stats we want, but the end result is a net negative for me. Build complexity is at its best when you have a host of different options, providing lots of control over how the build fits together, plus tangible effects on the gameplay, which creates opportunities for creativity and innovation.
So this is my counterpoint. She's one of the people that really wanted a lot of complexity in the character building, but then complained about the mechanical complexity of playing the game, of actually playing the game. I think it's fair to say that Kuro preferred something with less complexity in the actual character building, pretty like cut and paste, easy to understand stats and what to like know is best in slot, and then made the combat more complicated, the actual execution, while the prep time you don't nearly have as much of it. And so from this point of view, I think it's well balanced in that you don't need a PhD to build the character or build team comps. Remember that whole thing about ICDs in Genshin Impact, guys?
What the hell? Oh my god!
You need like to actually do research to know whether or not your team can trigger reactions properly based off of the ICD and application of every unit on there. That's stupid. Just let me play the fucking game. Just let me play the game. And in WuWa, outside of extreme high level play where you're like trying to abuse certain swap windows, you kind of just play the game. You kind of just practice and play the game. You don't need a fucking PhD to understand like how to trigger the maximum number of coordinated attacks or when to precisely cancel a move to ensure that like all of the ticks are happening. You just kind of practice, you get a feel for it, and it works. And so I don't really see a problem with the builds not being complex, because it just means you spend less time in the stat menu and more time, you know, attacking things.
I got a motherfucking boner.
Creativity and innovation in how players approach the game. In WuWa, from what I can tell, there's usually only one ideal build for each character, and the equipment system just boils down to a grind towards that singular goal. People love the lack of 50-50 for weapons, but in this game, the free weapons are so trash that if you want any semblance of the power level you'd expect, you're basically required to spend your astrites on the weapon banner, especially for DPS characters.
What about Emerald to Genesis or Static Mist though? What about that though?
Ignoring that one gripe about the weapons, the one positive thing I have to say about builds overall is that characters are generally strong enough, even with mediocre builds, as long as you're skilled enough. So the really painful parts of the equipment system can largely be skipped. Gear systems in gacha games are generally pretty awful, and I wish the developers would innovate and find some way to hook players on that treadmill of randomized incremental gains, which is not pure pain to interact with. One innovation WuWa brought here is that you can farm echoes in the open world, but in practice it's even more of a grind to endlessly trek across the map to hunt them, especially because you still need to spend wave plates in order to get the EXP and tuners to actually level them and reveal their substats. If anything, looking at the world and seeing a near endless supply of potential echoes to farm just makes the whole endeavor feel even more futile to me. I could not dislike echoes more. I'd honestly love to hear from people who actually enjoy it, since at this point I legitimately cannot see any redeeming qualities.
Let me give you some of them. First, it's way faster to get actual rollable things in the first place. You're not limited by RNG in whether or not you can even upgrade a piece in the first place. You only need maybe 3 or 4 substats, and you only need to roll them once to make a piece pretty good. You are pretty constantly able to recycle, refresh your inventory, and it doesn't require insane builds to clear. You kind of just already said that before in build complexity. You don't need insane gear to clear the end game, because you can make it up with skill. So there are multiple routes to actually clearing the content, and none of them are really reliant on echoes in the first place. And I guess at this point, right, it's like, especially if we're coming from Genshin Impact, a game where we can farm 6 months for a character in a domain and then never get the actual piece and never use that experience, and we just sit there holding our dick for a whole half of a calendar year with nothing to do. The fact that that can happen in Genshin Impact is insane. And that literally cannot happen in Wuthering Waves. If you have 1,000 tuners and a shit ton of echo experience, you can decide to go farm and go grind and spend all of it in a day. If you really wanted to, you could do that. If you have 2,000 artifact XP in Genshin, go fuck yourself. Go roll in the domain and hope you get something worth upgrading. Pray to God you get something you can upgrade with all of that EXP. Because otherwise it's just going to sit in your inventory not doing anything.
My personal favorite dimension from similar combat games is team complexity, and sadly it's one which I felt is a little neglected in WuWa. It exists in the interaction between the combat system, the characters' kits, and how they fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. I love getting a clear understanding of how multiple characters work and figuring out unusual ways to make them complement each other to create teams which are more powerful than you'd expect. This was the type of complexity I was hoping for after reaching the endgame content, since it's the kind of thing which captures my imagination and gets me thinking about the game even when I'm doing anything else. Sadly, I've never felt it was really there in WuWa. Swapping characters out for different options has only minor effects on how the team works, and any synergies and trade-offs when building teams are fairly surface level. Each DPS has a very limited list of ideal team members. For example, they might specifically need coordinated attacks or someone who charges forte quickly, and there's not much scope for variety within those roles. It's certainly possible that I'm just missing something, but after months of playing daily, despite enjoying the mechanical complexity in the moment, the lack of team complexity meant that the combat just didn't capture my imagination in the way that I had hoped for.
So I do think the element, the glue that she's missing over here is quite literally swapping windows for characters, and how certain characters are able to gain huge benefits from swapping, even like regular swapping, while others don't. Like Zhang Liao Yinlin is a team, or Zhang Liao Yang Yang is a team that basically plays like hyper carry, but lets you quick swap like it's quick swap in the middle of Zhang Li's rotation without losing any buffs. You have that element. Yang Yang is like that sort of character. You have Sanhua, who has, you know, minor buffs to some characters, but an extremely fast rotation time that lets people who rely on intro skills like Chang Li to do a little bit more or have a bit more of an active playstyle as a main DPS. I mean, this again just feels like the reviewer having surface level experience with the combat of the game, not taking any time to dig deeper into any of the potential mechanics, and then making a conclusion off of it. I think that's pretty fair to say. Very baseline, shallow understanding of the game's combat and systems, and then going ahead and making a wide sweeping conclusion on it based off of that lack of understanding. That's what it seems like to me. Disagree with me. Halt, evildoer! You shall not disrespect the lady like this. Not on my watch, cretin.
And when it comes to the endgame content, I again have mixed feelings. I dislike the Tower of Adversity overall. Time challenges are rarely my cup of tea.
Oh, I hate time challenges. I hate being forced to do things in a time limit. I just want to enter an endgame mode and take my sweet ass time and have no limitations on anything at all.
And what's the fucking point? The time limit is there so that it rewards you for investing in gear. It rewards you for learning your team's rotations. It rewards you for crafting good team comps. I mean, I don't understand the issue with it. I still don't. And people are like, oh, well, dodging eats into... It also makes your supports rotations go faster. Oh, but parrying slows down. Oh, it also opens up damage windows against certain enemies if you parry them. It's just every mechanic works together in a time-limited environment. I actually have not seen a legitimate argument for why the time limit actually is bad, other than I just don't like a timer. The only argument people have against the time limit being bad is literally their opinion that they don't like time limits. I also don't like opinionated arguments, so theirs sucks.
I dislike the Tower of Adversity overall. Time challenges are rarely my cup of tea, and the bar is set too high for me to enjoy it.
And that's literally it, right? That's literally the only detracting thing that we have, is that I don't like time-limited challenges, so the mode is bad.
And the bar is set too high for me to enjoy it. The two normal towers are fun enough that I do them anyway to gain the rewards, but it doesn't feel worth grinding the boss enemies to get familiar with their timing just to be able to get all the stars. After all, I've got so many other things to spend my time on which I actually enjoy. Instead, I end up with somewhere around 22 to 24 stars and skip the hazard tower entirely. The tower's vigor system deserves some praise though. You can mix and match different teams on the same floor, go back and swap in something completely different for one floor to free up a character without having to start over, and even share equipment between characters if you really want to. This removes many points of friction which can ruin similar modes in other games for people who enjoy this kind of content, and on balance, the tower is probably better overall than my personal dislike for it really conveys. The tactical holograms are a similar story. They're very much a test of your mechanical skill and ability to memorize enemy movesets, a clear example of the kind of content which is just not aimed at me. If you enjoy getting your head smashed in over and over as you learn the perfect timing for an enemy, then you'll probably love them. The Elusive Realm, on the other hand, I absolutely love. It's the only endgame in any similar game that I happily spend time replaying just for fun, even after collecting all the important rewards. It really leans into the strengths of WuWa's combat systems.
Guys, this might be a hot take. I think the Elusive Realm is literally just a meme. It's just, you just go in, you get a fuck ton of upgrades, and then you have a visual seizure on the screen, and then one-shot everything. It's just a fuck ton of numbers on the screen. It's fun in the same sense that scrolling on TikTok watching brain rot videos is fun. Elusive Realm is like the brain rot version of WuWa's combat. Yeah, it's fun every once in a while, but it's also like not something that I feel like I'm like actively doing. Like it is fun. Like guys, it's like having a no cooldown game mode in League of Legends. Ultra rapid fire. Your abilities have no cooldown and you get to go ahead and just do whatever you want for the game mode. That's fun once in a while, but it's also nice having the actual rules of the game to play. How would you improve Elusive Realm? I think the Elusive Realm is fine. I just don't think it's something that, if somebody's saying that their main way of playing the game is through the Elusive Realm, that to me is like someone saying their main way of playing League of Legends is through Earth mode, and they don't play anything else. And if that's what you enjoy, that's cool, but also recognize that it's just mainly for fun. It's mainly for fun, because it doesn't go by the rules of any other content in the game. And if you're somebody that says Elusive Realm is amazing and better than other game modes, then that means to me that your take is you don't fully understand what the baseline game is bringing and you just want to have fun, and that's fine. But this is the whole argument that having constraints, having limitations, having mechanics that you have to interact with and follow, that's saying that that can be fun, right? Actually, having cooldowns, well, that can be fun. to work around the cooldowns. Elusive Realm, you kind of have no cooldowns on anything. You're just like spamming everything you can on the screen, and then you're going from there. That is what the game mode is.
Combat system sprinkled in some player choice and differentiated reward systems, and builds up to a finale where your character feels incredibly powerful even though you're fighting massively overpowered bosses. My only real complaint with the Elusive Realm is that it's not always available. It's been missing entirely in the week or two since I re-downloaded the game, and I sorely miss it.
Also, potentially off topic, but if the Elusive Realm is the only version of the game where you think you're good, you probably do suck at the game. Probably. If you can only perform well in the Elusive Realm, you probably do suck at the game. I'm gonna be honest. That's just, you suck balls. I think that's indisputable.
When it comes to combat, version 2 generally brings more of the same. More characters, more weapons, more echo sets, more enemies. I enjoyed many of the new combat challenges scattered around the overworld, and the Nightmare Echoes are a cool way to add new options to older characters. On balance, it's pretty great, and if you're in the target audience, then there's a ton of depth within the areas it's aiming to get right to keep it engaging for a long time. But sadly, I prefer an emphasis on other types of complexity, so while it's still fun, it's not quite enough to really capture my imagination.
Well, I mean, she is a Genshin Impact player after all, right? The complexity is in the fucking, whether or not you can apply your ICDs and trigger elemental reactions on certain parts of a character's kit. So you need Jeff with a fucking Excel spreadsheet just to understand if two characters can actually work together in the first place. I love that. That's a ton of fun. Oh, I love it. Just kidding, it's dog shit. It's fucking stupid and annoying.
A game which gets both right would be the dream for me, but sadly I've yet to find one which manages that. And I really wish they would keep the Elusive Realm available. It's by far and away the standout in the game for me.
Remember what I said, guys? Remember what I just said, guys?
I had really high hopes for WuWa's story. I love sci-fi, and post-apocalyptic setting can be incredibly interesting. I'd heard that Kuro's other games had rough starts, but improved a ton over time, so I was hoping, with all that experience, they could maybe be able to start strong this time and get even better from there. The cinematics really sold me on this. They are absolutely stunning, and really raised the bar for what to expect from a game like this. And, interestingly, the cinematography and character animation outside of the cinematics was top tier too. I often found myself thinking we had transitioned into a cutscene when actually it was just some deftly executed camera work within the game engine itself.
Okay,
unfortunately,
some good old
this was
glazing.
all style over substance, and the story became a major reason for me quitting the game. The narrative never hooked me in, the characters never caught my eye, and the conversations just washed past me and never stuck in my memory. From the get-go, the Rover's treatment by the other characters was just not my cup of tea. It felt like they had some inexplicable magnetism, which took so much precedence over the rest of the characters' personalities that they came across as hollow. As the story progressed, this got more and more pronounced, and the female leads in particular went from inexplicably trusting to inexplicably infatuated with the Rover.
I have a simple reason for all of this. They're actually doing things. They're actually defeating monsters. They're actually blowing things up. They're actually beating stuff. You know, if you're familiar with a game like Genshin Impact, you would notice that all the Traveler does is hold a camera, basically, the entire fucking game. They do a couple of things, but guess who blocks Raiden's blade? It's Kazuha. He does that. Guess who does all the work against Scaramouche? It's Nahida. And her weird fucking robot that shoots lasers. Or sorry, her weird little pet that shoots lasers. You're just a glorified errand boy. You don't do anything. Guess who beats the whale? It's Nouvelette, not you. Nothing ever happens.
Every step along the way just felt like it was emphasizing that I was not the target audience. And before anyone who loved this aspect gets upset, let's make it clear, I do not expect every game to be tailored to my tastes. I've got Infinity Nikki for that. But when people ask me what made me lose interest in the game I had previously been super excited about, it's important to be honest. The perfect example of this was Camellia. I loved her design from the moment we first caught a glimpse of her and waited impatiently for her to come out since day one. But when she did come out, after pulling for her, I watched her story through another player's stream and basically uninstalled the game. Okay, not actually because of that, but it was another source of disappointment that finally tipped the scales. Maybe some people loved it, and maybe it's my own fault for having different expectations for what her character might be like, but turning her into just another Rover simp slightly soiled her for me. Camellia is still my favorite, and I like playing her, but her characterization just completely severed any emotional connection I felt towards her.
Yeah, I think that's... I'm gonna be honest, I feel like that speaks more about the reviewer. Speaks more about the reviewer than the game. Because you got, I mean, You had plenty of stuff in her story quest. The only thing is that you have been her savior from the start. That's kind of the main thing, but she still does a bunch of stuff on her own. She literally has the entire sequence in her story quest where she's in the Tethys system, and you get to see like all of those different possibilities about her. And then she goes ahead and she literally fights herself as well. I mean, if that's persuading you to have no emotional connection to her at all, and makes you want to uninstall the game, hey, go for it. I guess this is the thing that I'm also hearing off of that is she is building an emotional connection to the main character, which is the self-insert for the player. And so her having a connection to the main character, who is the self-insert for the player, resulting in you having a severed connection, that sounds a little weird, in my opinion. That seems like a little bit weird, because Wuthering Waves' main character is a self-insert, 1000%. And so her having a relationship with the main character suddenly severed the connection to you, the player. That's a little weird.
My experience with her is more extreme example of how almost all the characters came across to me, and since they didn't capture my attention, I had no investment in the story, and I felt no urge to pull. The rare exception is Alto, which is why I play him a lot, but the rest just left me uninterested. Over time, the character designs seem to be getting progressively more fan-servicey, and the lack of male characters has caused some discussions on Reddit. All of this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does emphasize that I might not be the target audience of the game, which is always a little disappointing when there's so much of it which feels so close to being exactly what I'd want. All of this left me less and less interested in the story over time. After trying my best for the first few patches, I have to admit I ended up using the skip button. And this experience proved to me just how bad a skip button can be for these games.
Are we calling the skip button bad now? Oh dear. Oh fucking dear.
And this experience proved to me just how bad a skip button can be for these games. It's something people often cry out for when it's missing, or praise it when it's available. As someone who has serious complaints about the slop dialogue prevalent in gacha games, I was firmly on the side of people who are in favor of this feature. However, after my experience with WuWa, I'm no longer quite so sure. Once you start pressing skip, it's hard to recapture any level of investment in the plot.
So don't click it. You're the one that said, well, I wasn't that engaged in the plot and the story, so I decided to start using the skip button. But the problem with that is that now that I'm skipping the plot and the story that I wasn't interested in, it's hard for me to get re-engaged with it.
No fucking shit.
No shit. The game allowed you to not interact or do the content that you didn't want to do, giving you the voluntary choice not to consume the media you didn't want to, while other games without a skip button literally force you to do something you don't want to do. And you're saying being forced to do something is better? Oh my god.
After all, you don't really know what's going on anymore, and if you're not invested in the plot, you'll never get to know the characters.
Because you chose to skip because you didn't care.
Even if you enjoy other aspects of the game, lacking any connection to the characters in a gacha game really sucks any sense of purpose in playing. In WuWa's case, that didn't feel like much of a loss for me due to the problems I just mentioned, but it still contributed to the game feeling hollow to me.
What do you know? When you skip the story, the game feels a bit more empty. This is a generational fumble in the last... This is like a generational fumble in the last, like, 5 minutes of the video.
What's a story game if you don't keep up with the story? I heard rave reviews of Rinasita's story, but was very apprehensive about it. Many people enjoyed parts of the earlier story which I had just bounced right off. Even so, I resolved to avoid the skip button and give it my full attention in the hopes that it would finally capture some storytelling magic. Rinasita's story is a noticeable improvement on all counts, with much improved storytelling and pacing, and it's particularly welcome to see the characters interact with one another rather than being entirely focused on the rover. However, I'm still a little underwhelmed. It's not bad, and I appreciate the leap in quality, but despite that, it still failed to get me invested in anything that was happening and ended up feeling like a bit of a slog towards the end.
I think she's just lying. There's like no actual reason for it. There's like just no actual reason for it. Here's all the good stuff that happened, but I just didn't like it. Why? Why? what was wrong with it?
If version 1 was a 2 out of 10 for me, and I was hoping for an 8 out of 10, I'd maybe give Renacita a solid 6. It may be that this is because Carlotta echoed the issues I had in the earlier chapters, or because I still don't particularly like any of the character designs, so I'll still hold out hope that later chapters will really suck me in. While Carlotta stands out since she was center stage for so much of the story so far, the same is true for the other characters. We didn't get to know all that much about Zani, Brandt, Rocha, or even Phoebe, for example, and I still don't feel much of a connection to any of them.
It's version 2.0. There's still 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and 2.4.
I do actually like Brandt though, so perhaps if he's more central in the upcoming patch, it'll start working a little better for me. The setup also appears very black and white, despite the Montellis having such mafia vibes.
Black and white? They just introduced so much complexity. Literally, Phoebe is a character from the Order faction, which we've been... Like, Phoebe is clearly on our side, but she's also a part of the Order faction, which has also been viewed as a villain across the entire 2.0 quest. The fact she's saying it was black and white actually, I think, lends credence to the fact that maybe she didn't play the story at all. How could you call this black and white with Phoebe simply existing in the game? Phoebe literally had a whole moment with Lorelei where she was like questioning everything she ever knew. The Phasalia family is viewed as like villains, but they're literally only a small subsect of the Phasalia family are the actual villains.
Maybe that's just because we're early on in the arc and we'll see more of morally
Okay.
grey narrative emerge over time.
Yes.
Many people will argue that it's unfair to have high expectations of a gacha game's narrative. I wholeheartedly disagree, but that's a discussion best left for another time. Overall, Wuthering Waves is a game I keep wanting to enjoy a lot. I waited for it for a long time, and so much of it feels like it's right up my alley, but I always find myself doubting whether it's actually for me. Many of the parts which don't appeal to me are objectively done really well, the combat's mechanical
Okay, that's
complexity
fair.
being the perfect example, and some of the other decisions are likely perfectly tuned to appeal to a different audience. I still hold out hope that WuWa will broaden its appeal just a little bit, since if it does, then it could be such a blast for people like me. Unless it does, while it comes close, it doesn't quite land. Until next time.
So overall, I think the review was actually pretty fair and pretty solid up until about the last maybe like 5 to 6 to 7 minutes. I started losing a grasp on what was actually being said in those last 5 to 6 to 7 minutes. I know a lot of people are saying, oh, it's her opinion, so she can say whatever she wants. Guys, this is the thing. If your opinion is stating that like certain things are like good or bad based off of really flawed logic or reasoning, people are allowed to say that the take sucks or that the take isn't good, or that the opinion is pretty much wrong. Takes on things like the skip button, takes on things like, oh, I didn't get enough exposure to characters that were just introduced in the new region. That's also like, how does that even make sense as a critique? To say that we don't, yeah, we learned a lot about Carlotta, but we didn't learn a lot about the other characters who aren't on banner, who are going to come in the next version of the game. That to me is like, that's simply the structure of the story. Yet and it's just a lot of the stuff in here, knowing that they're a Genshin Impact creator is like, it just seems like there's a very unfair lens on so many things and aspects that are being critiqued here. Some of the points were very fair, but other points are kind of just like surface level exposure to the game, or like stuff that just doesn't make sense. Oh, I'm sorry you didn't get the full breakdown on every new character in 2.0. I'm sorry that this patch was focused on Rosia and Carlotta, the two characters who are on banner for the patch. And I'm sorry it didn't dive into the deep stories of Brandt, Phoebe, and Zani, who are later releases. I guess this is the thing. It's like these are just like some weird overall takes. And a lot of the stuff in the combat is kind of just like, I want complexity, but not in the combat. I want complexity in the menus. And that's a big critique for Genshin Impact, is that the game Genshin Impact, half of the gameplay is just before you even fight anything. You have to micromanage so much bullshit in like the actual team building for Genshin teams to actually work. While in WuWa, you kind of just play the fucking game and make sure you press outro skills in the right order. But other than that, you're pretty freeform to do whatever you want. So overall, I think the take is, the main word I'll use for this take is short-sighted and extremely biased. And they're entitled, right? Because they're talking about their perspective to have their personal opinion. But I think players looking at this and reviewing this review are entitled to say that the opinion is bad and based off of faulty reasoning. And this is the thing. When you have a female on the internet, you're gonna have some very big fans. You're gonna have some very big fans like this who just talk too much. Oh, the lady merely gave her opinion. How dare you criticize a single thing she said? How dare you? It's just her opinion. Evildoer. Just shut up. It's a public review that she's looking for feedback on. She literally asked people to share their thoughts on her thoughts, and that's what I'm doing right now. Stop being a freak. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me know what you all think about my takes on this review. Peace out.